Welcome back to the Real Number System. In this video, we're going to pick up in section 5.1 and we're going to talk about models for subtraction. So let's get started. Let's look at our chip model for subtraction. For the chip model, we're going to think about subtraction as take away. So for instance, if we have 3 minus negative 2, so the 3 tells us we start with 3 positives. And notice in part A, we have 3 positives, or 3 yellow chips. The minus tells us to take away, and after the minus tells us what we're taking away. So we're going to take away 2 negatives. Well, notice in my diagram, I don't have 2 negatives to take away. So what I do is I add 0 in the form of positives and negatives. So here, we've added 0 in the form of 2 positives and 2 negatives. This now gives me 2 negatives to take away, and I circle those and draw an arrow to show that I'm taking them away. And so 3 minus negative 2 is 5. Let's look at some more examples. Now in example 9, I'm actually going to start with part C. So in part C, we have negative 3 minus negative 2. So negative 3 tells us we start with 3 negatives. The minus tells us we're going to take away. And after the minus, we know what we take away. We take away 2 negatives. So I start with 3 negatives. Then I'm going to take away 2 negatives. So I'm going to circle 2 of those negatives and draw an arrow to show that I'm taking those away. And notice that we're left with 1 negative in our circle. So negative 3 minus negative 2 is negative 1. Let's look at part D. We have 4 minus 1. The 4 tells us we start with 4 positives. The minus tells us to take away, and we take away 1 positive. So I start my circle with 4 positives. Then I'm going to take away 1 of those positives, and I'm left with 3 positives. And so 4 minus 1 is 3. Now, let's go back and look at part A. So in part A, we have negative 2 minus 3. So the negative 2 tells me I start with 2 negatives. So I'm going to draw 2 negatives in my set. The minus tells me to take away, and after the minus, I'm taking away 3 positives. Now in my set, I don't have 3 positives to take away. So I add 0. So a 0 would be a positive and a negative. And I'm going to keep putting in 0, positive and negative until I have 3 positives. So a positive and negative, that's 0, and a positive and a negative is 0. Now I have 3 positives, so I can take away those 3 positives. I circle them and draw an arrow to show that I'm taking those out of that circle. And I'm left with 5 negatives in my circle. So negative 2 minus 3 is negative 5. Let's look at another one. In part B, we have 2 minus negative 5. So for 2, I start with 2 positives. The minus tells me to take away, and I take away 5 negatives. Now in my set, I don't have any negatives to take away. So I add 0, a positive and a negative, until I have 5 negatives. So a positive and negative, that's 0. Add a positive and negative, add positive and negative, positive, negative, and positive, negative. When I add the positive and negatives, I'm not changing my number any because I'm adding 0 in there. Now notice that I have 5 negatives. So I can take away those 5 negatives, and in my circle, I'm left with 7 positives. So 2 minus negative 5 is positive 7. Our next model is our number line model. For the number line model, we're going to change subtraction to addition and then model on our number line. So negative 2 minus 3. Well, this is the same thing as negative 2 plus negative 3. Draw your number line Typically on your number line, you can count from about -5 to +5. -2 tells me to start at 0 and jump to the left 2. Then -3 tells me I jump left 3 more, and notice that we land on -5. And so our answer here is -5. In part B, we have 2 minus -5. Well, the minus -5, that's like saying the opposite of -5. So this would be 2 plus 5. Now, since both of these numbers are positive, I'm going to start at 0 on my number line, and I'm going to count up to about 10. I start at 0, and I jump 2 to the right to represent +2, and then I jump 5 more to the right, and I land at 7. So 2 minus -5 is 7. Look at part C. We have -3 minus -2. Well, the minus the -2, that's the opposite of -2, so that's plus. We have -3 plus 2. Draw your number line. You can count from about -5 to about 5 on your number line. The -3 tells me I start at 0 and I jump to the left 3. Then plus 2 tells me to jump to the right 2. And notice we land on -1. And so -3 minus -2 is -1. For part D, we have 4 minus 1. So this is the same thing as 4 plus -1. Draw your number line. Count from about -5 to about 5 in most cases. To represent 4, we start at 0 and we jump to the right 4. Then plus -1, that tells me to jump to the left 1, and notice we land at 3. So 4 minus 1 is 3. We can also use patterns to represent our subtraction. Start with subtractions that children are familiar with, and we develop a pattern from those subtractions. In part A, 3 minus 2 is 1, 3 minus 1 is 2, and 3 minus 0 is 3. Notice my first number is the same. The second number, what I was subtracting, decreased by 1. And notice the difference, the answer when I subtracted increased by 1. To continue my pattern, 3 minus -1 then would be 4, and 3 minus -2 would be 5. Look at part B. I'm actually going to start with 3 minus 1. So 3 minus 1 is 2, 3 minus 2 is 1, and 3 minus 3 is 0. Notice we're starting with 3 each time, and the number that I subtracted is going up by 1. 1, 2, 3 is what I subtracted. My difference, my answer, went down by 1. 2, 1, 0. So I'm going to keep this pattern. As the number that I'm subtracting goes up by 1, my difference goes down by 1. So 3 minus 4 would be -1. 3 minus 5 would be -2. And 3 minus 6 would be -3. Some children will understand subtraction better using a pattern. Recall that subtraction is neither commutative nor associative, and the order of operations tells us to perform our subtraction from left to right. In part A, we have 2 minus 5 minus 5. So we perform our subtractions from left to right. 2 minus 5 would be -3. Now, a trick when you're subtracting is this. Notice that these have opposite signs, a +2 and a -5. When I have opposite signs, I subtract my two numbers and I take the sign of the larger. So here, 2 minus 5, opposite signs. So I subtract 5 minus 2 is 3, and I take the sign of the larger numbers. 5 was larger, and that's how I get that -3. Bring down your -5. Now notice that these have the same sign. -3 minus 5 is -8. When I have the same sign, I'm going to add my two numbers. So 3 plus 5 is 8, and I kept that negative sign to make -8. In part B, 3 minus 7 is -4. These have opposite signs, so I subtract my numbers. 7 minus 3 is 4, and I take the sign of the larger number. 7 is the larger number, so I kept that negative sign. Bring down the plus 3. Again, these have opposite signs, so I subtract. 4 minus 3 is 1, and I take the sign of the larger number. 4 is the larger number, and so I keep that negative sign. In part C, I start with my parentheses. 7 minus 3 is 4. Bring down your 3 minus. These two have opposite signs, so I subtract, and I take the sign of the larger, so 3 minus 4 would be negative 1.